Honest question, is it okay to hate this person? Now look, I understand that hate is a very strong word, especially in a video from a channel that deals exclusively about slavery, but how about strongly dislike? Because I strongly dislike Candace Owens. And in this PragerU video, Candace Owens is about to spend 5 minutes not giving you a history of slavery, but instead trying to take the guilt of slavery away from white people in the United States and to make the American slaveocracy seem less racist. Now, she does a terrible job of this, by the way, but if you'd like to waste 5 minutes of your life, the link to the video will be in the description. So the first point she makes in this video is that, quote, slavery was not invented by white people, end quote. Okay, whoever said that it was? Not me, not anyone else I know, not anyone else who, in the corpus of individuals who have studied the history of slavery, no one has said that slavery was invented by white people. She then notes that slavery didn't start in 1619. And Candace, you're right, it didn't. But that is the accepted date for when it started in America. This was the beginning of the horrific system based in white supremacy and racism towards Africans. She next said that slavery didn't start when Columbus, quote, discovered the New World, which in and of itself is very telling, since the indigenous people who were already living here, I'm sure were very surprised to find out they were in fact discovered, right? So sure, let's give it to her. Slavery didn't start with Columbus, but this, quote, discovery was the foundation for what would become African slavery in the United States. You see, Thomas R.R. Cobb, in his Inquiry into the Law of Negro Slavery in the United States, noted that, quote, the discovery of America in 1492 was an event, the effect of which upon the civilized world can never be calculated and perhaps never fully appreciated. It furnished a receptacle for the innumerable slaves which the African petty kings offered in exchange for the manufactured and gaudy trinkets of Europe, end quote. Now, we'll get back to that end part in a second as well, so hold on to your butts for that one. But as you can see, Cobb believed that Columbus's discovery opened the door for the institution of African slavery. Now, as Cobb also notes, the Spanish enslaved the natives to use in their mining and other operations. But due to disease brought over from Europe, many died, and the enslavement of indigenous Americans therefore was not a viable system for the Spanish. Now, horrifically enough, Cobb and others like him would use this to justify the enslavement of Africans, because to Cobb, the reason Native Americans failed as slaves was because it was contrary to their nature, whereas the African, who was of course created by God to be enslaved, would prosper and benefit from being enslaved by the white man. So this need to replace the indigenous slaves is what sent Europeans looking to Africa. Now, Candace next moves on to explain that slavery existed in Africa, it existed in Asia, it existed in Europe. In fact, she declares that the word slave comes from the word Slav. So it had white European origins. Great, Candace. Do you think this poor soul cared where the term slave originated from? Tell all of this to the millions of Africans enslaved under a system that justified their enslavement because they were inferior to Caucasians and slavery was considered to be their natural condition. Candace tells us that slavery existed in Rome, Greece, Persia, and keeps trying to hammer home that whites were also enslaved. Yes, Candace, we know, but as I've said so many times, so what? How does any of this take away from the white supremacist foundations of African slavery in the United States? This video is simply trying to deflect blame from whites and to try to minimize the system of slavery in the United States by pointing to the rest of the world. She then brings up Aristotle, and I'm so glad that she did, because she rightly claimed that Aristotle considered slavery to be natural. Now, full disclosure, I am no Greek historian or philosopher, but I can tell you how antebellum jurists and white supremacists used Aristotle to justify the enslavement of Africans. So Aristotle believed that while most human beings have the capacity for reason, which allows them to control their desires and to make thoughtful decisions, there were some individuals who fundamentally lacked this ability. According to him, these individuals might be able to understand and follow the reasoning of others, but they could not engage in rational deliberation themselves. Aristotle referred to these people as natural slaves. He argued that because they could not govern themselves through reason, it was both just and beneficial for them, remember this, to be ruled by those who could. In his view, being under the control of a rational master was not only appropriate, but was also in the best interest of natural slaves who would otherwise make poor choices if they were left on their own. And guess who the antebellum slavocrats believed were incapable of governing themselves and needed a superior race to guide, control, and of course use them for forced labor. Great, right? Yay, Aristotle. Okay. Now at this point she's still going, and wait till you see how little we've even progressed in this video. She goes on to say slavery existed with the Egyptians 5,000 years ago. It takes her a minute and 45 seconds of a 5-minute long video to explain that slavery has been around forever and that it wasn't just white people enslaving black people. Okay, Candace, to what end? Why? What is the point of this? It's clear from the tone that this is not a video about the history of slavery. This is not a video about slavery's history. This is a video about how not only whites were the enslavers, right? Wonderful. However, none of this takes away from the fact that the antebellum South and the Confederacy were slave societies, not simply a society with slaves. Slaves were simply one component of the society. They and the white supremacists that created and sustained the system were the foundation of the society. Racial African slavery, white supremacy, was the foundation of the antebellum South and of what would become the Confederacy. So let's see what this stooge has to say next. She next says, white people were the first to put an end to slavery. Cool, Candace. But, Candace, you might be giving white people too much credit here. Yes, white people did end slavery in their respective nations, but not without a fight. And Britain is not a great example for someone like Candace to use here. Britain emancipated slaves in 1833, but this emancipation called for a gradual emancipation over the span of 10 years, and it was a compensated emancipation, meaning slaveholders were given money to compensate for the loss of their slaves. Also, it worked because, unlike the United States, slaveholders had very little political power in the British Empire. Members of British Parliament were elected by votes within Great Britain proper, so England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Slavery was never legal in Great Britain proper, and therefore these politicians had little reason to fight for the institution of slavery. This allowed the government to abolish slavery because no one in the government was fighting to keep it. A better example when talking about the United States and comparing it is to look at Brazil, which didn't outlaw slavery till 1888. Slavery there was ended by an imperial decree, which caused such an uproar from the plantation-owning enslavers that it directly contributed to the overthrow of the monarchy a year later. So, everywhere where white slave owners had political power, they vehemently opposed ending slavery. This is what we saw in the United States. The politically powerful white slaveholders refused to give up or even think of giving up the institution of slavery, which led to the secession of 11 slaveholding states. So Candace, she's still going. She goes on to rant and explain how no one is sinless when it comes to slavery. And look, I'll agree with her on this one. With this, she is very true. But she then starts to ramble on about how we don't hear about the heinous actions under the Mongols, the Chinese, or others, but rather we are told that slavery is a white phenomenon. But do you know why that is, Candace? Do you know why here in the United States we focus on the horrors of whites enslaving Africans? Because no one is building monuments to Barbary pirate leaders in American cities. No one is naming schools or military bases after enslaving Mongol heroes. But you know who is having monuments defended and schools and military bases named after them? White enslavers of Africans. And there is a movement, a dedicated movement to protect and defend the legacy of these white supremacists and the slaveocracy they created and fought to defend. Maybe, Candace, just maybe, that's why we hear so much about it here in the United States, right? Her next move is to say how Africans sold other Africans into slavery. But we know this. What does this have to do with the price of tea in China, Candace? Remember Thomas R. Cobb, who we talked about earlier? He said that the discovery of the Americas, quote, furnished a receptacle for the innumerable slaves which the African petty kings offered in exchange for manufactured and gaudy trinkets of Europe, end quote. Cobb even noted how the demand for slaves would most likely increase the petty wars between the African tribes to keep the supply of slaves up with Europeans' demands. But again, how does this take away from the white supremacist foundations of slavery in the antebellum United States? She said that whites didn't go into Africa to round up slaves, but waited for other Africans to get slaves for them. Well, yes, we know this. Everyone at the time knew it too. And do you know why, Candace? Because the interior of Africa was a death sentence for a European. Thanks to disease, Europeans knew to stay far away from the African interior. So what did they do? They used other Africans who were willing to trade goods for slaves. There's nothing more to it than that. But you know what whites weren't doing, Candace? Whites weren't docking in London and enslaving other whites. And why not? Because the system of slavery found in what would become the antebellum South and eventually the Confederacy was based on race and white supremacy. So in the end, what did Candace and PragerU give us? A deflection tactic, an elaborate attempt to shift the focus away from the uniquely racialized system of African slavery in the United States and to minimize white culpability in it. By emphasizing the global and historical existence of slavery, they try to dilute the specific horrors and racial ideology that underpinned American chattel slavery. Candace's repeated claims that slavery existed everywhere or that Africans sold other Africans do nothing, let me be clear, do nothing to challenge the fact that the American system was explicitly built on white supremacy and the belief that black people were inherently inferior. So rather than educating viewers about the real historical foundations and consequences of slavery in America, the video obscures them. It reinforces a narrative that excuses or downplays the role of white Americans and the role that white Americans played in sustaining and defending a brutally dehumanizing institution.